Hello everyone, it's Deborah at Laurie's Country Cottage. Today on How Tuesday, I'd like to show you how to get started doing embroidery. So we'll start with looking at the materials and supplies you're going to need to do some simple embroidery projects. Let's begin with an embroidery hoop. You're going to need an embroidery hoop to keep the material taut and not stretched drum tight, but tight enough to keep your stitches laying down without any tucks created in the fabric. You're going to want a pair of good sharp snips that will snip close to the edge of your knots. You're going to need some embroidery thread. Embroidery thread can be, there's many threads that can be used for embroidery, but what I favor is the 6-strand cotton mercerized threads that come in skeins like this DMC product, or this size 12 thread that comes on a spool. This is a sulky product and it comes in various colors, and it will allow you to get started stitching without having to do any thread division to begin with. You might want some way to efficiently and quickly thread your needle, so we've got some needle threaders here to show you. You'll want to protect your finger with some sort of thimble. I prefer these thimble pads. They don't enclose my finger, they just allow my finger to be protected with that little leather piece, but I don't get pokes backing up into my finger. And then some sort of transfer pencil you might eventually want when you want to start creating your own designs. A source of design can be found in many locations. I'm a collector of vintage embroidery patterns, and so I have all of these vintage pieces that I've obtained by just going to garage sales or getting them from my great aunts and etc. I've found some designs in needlework magazines. You can copy them and use them for your own particular use. You can purchase books of embroidery transfers, and you can, of course, draw your own. This particular design is a vintage design that I photocopied from a really old magazine and then used the transfer pencil to create the design that I eventually stitched. So besides designs then, you're going to need some fabric to actually stitch on. Whenever linen comes into the store, I always grab a little bit of it because it's useful for making embroidered tea towels. That's what these are eventually going to be. We also carry in the store actual linen or cotton linen blend for making tea towels. This particular fabric is pre-hemmed on the sides, so all you have to do is put your design in there and stitch it up. Or you can, of course, just buy plain white cotton and use it for a myriad of things like pillowcases. That's what I would start with, is plain white cotton, and make some pillowcases just to get started. So a quick and easy sample to get started with is a basic plain pillowcase in which you are going to embroider a cuff area. Notice that I have folded down this cuff on this piece of fabric so that when I place my embroidery stitches on the cuff, all my knots and loose threads back here will get covered up when I actually construct the pillowcase into its final format. To make a pillowcase, purchase about 1 meter of fabric and then prepare that cuff area by turning over on the top ripped edge or cut edge, turning over about 1/2 inch, and then turning it again 6 inches to create that cuff. When you go to actually do the embroidery stitches, you will put your hoop in here so that all the knots are underneath there, and they're going to get covered up when you make the final pillowcase in its construction. Optionally, alternately, you could just make some tea towels. So I purchased some linen fabrics. I've cut a piece that's about 18 by 24, and you'll see I actually ripped it. I really want to have my fabric on grain. So I just ripped it, pressed it out, and then I pressed on my embroidery design and did the stitching. In this situation, I am accepting of the fact that my knots and thread ends are on the back of this tea towel. That's how it's going to look when it's done. But if that's not something you want to happen, then what you can do is purchase extra length of your tea toweling and again create a fold that's going to come up and cover the back side of the area that you're going to embroider. So by folding up that 6 to 8 inches, I can eventually fold it up and hem it and have my embroidery on there and have none of the knots or the rough stitches visible on the back of my work. Another option would be to simply purchase and work with the amount of fabric that you need to make a pillowcase cuff. We've all been making pillowcases for donations around here, and we know that a 0.3 or 12-inch piece of fabric makes a great pillowcase cuff. So again, I bought enough to make that 12-inch piece and to fold it over, and when I put my embroidery transfer on there, I will not sew through 2 layers, I'll sew through 1 layer, and I'll be able to hide those knots and thread ends. So you've prepped your fabric, and now you're ready to actually transfer the design that you wish to stitch. I'm going to use this 6-inch folded, 12-inch folded, 6-inch piece of fabric that I've prepared for a pillowcase cuff, and I am going to use an embroidery transfer that I purchased, so I trust that it's going to work. So a little side note for that, when you have vintage embroidery patterns, you might actually have purchased an embroidery pattern that's exhausted, that's already used up, and the person was just frugal enough to put it back in the envelope and save it. You still can use those designs, but you just have to do a little bit of work on your own. Get an embroidery heat transfer pencil, take a photocopy of the design that you want to use. In this case, it was a tissue paper design, so it's photocopied kind of gray, but you can lay it on a light table or up against a window, and you can just reverse the design by turning the page over and using the heat transfer pencil to draw your design. A thin line, dark and sharply placed on the pattern, will give you the best results. It's also reusable. Sometimes you'll get 2 transfers out of one work with the pencil, but it's also reprintable again. So I could use the heat transfer pencil and cover this design again with more of the heat transfer marking, and it would work again for me just as well. This particular pattern that I'm using of this little mouse in bed is of an envelope that I know I bought years ago, but I've never used it, so I'm pretty sure that it's going to transfer and that it's going to transfer okay. These old ones, even though they may not have been used, might give you really sketchy or spotty transfers, so I just recommend you just go the heat transfer pencil way and be sure that you're going to get a design. If you're artistic enough to want to be able to draw your own designs, by all means draw your design with a heat transfer pencil on a piece of white paper and turn that piece of paper into your own personal design. But just remember that we are going to lay that piece transfer pencil layer down, and so any writing or anything that it's important that it not be the mirror image is going to be an important thing to consider. So in this little pattern where it says mix, by the time I use the pencil on the back, it's now mix in mirror image, and it will transfer over correctly and make sense when it's transferred over. I'm ready to transfer this design onto my pillowcase cuff, and I want to just consider a couple of things. Where is my seam allowance going to be, and how much is going to be taken up? So I know that if I do a French seam on this side, I could very easily take up 2 centimeters of the fabric, and I know I'll probably use half an inch, half an inch, 3/4 of an inch to put this seam on here for sure. So I'm just taking care to note that before I make my markings for transferring. So I want to find both the vertical and horizontal halfway point. I'll just take it to the iron. I'll fold this cuff in half, but I'll leave those 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch, etc., that I'm going to use in the seam, and I'm just going to use the iron to make a quick fold mark that's going to give me an idea of where the halfway point is on my pillowcase. And I'm going to do the same thing along its length, and I just want to leave that little bit of space to account for the fact that the seams are going to take it up. So I have a little cross here now where I can orient my pattern and place it in position. So I'm taking my paper design and folding it in half and laying that halfway mark around the area where I've done this cross. And your design itself may be a little bit heavier on one side in terms of the design weight. So just eyeball it until you're happy with what you think that design looks like. Now this is an original transfer, so I'm pretty confident that it's going to transfer quite nicely. If I was using the transfers from the heat pencil, I would make sure, first of all, if there's photocopying on the other side, I would protect that with a piece of white paper because I don't want any photocopy material onto my iron. This one is perfectly fine. I know that it has no problem. And I also may have to hold the hot iron on my fabric a little longer, so that piece of paper will protect my fabric as well from scorching. I've set my iron to the hottest temperature my fabric can withstand. In this case it's cotton, so I've set my iron on cotton. And I am going to put my iron down, and I'm not going to let that paper slide. So when I move my iron from one section to the next, I'm going to just take the weight off the iron with my hand, not lift it, but just take it away. I'm not going to slide the iron on the fabric. So I begin dry iron, set on cotton, placed how I want it, and I'm going to let that sit there for 10, maybe 15 seconds. And I'm using my other hand to hold the transfer in place so it's not going to move. So if I count slowly to 10, then I'm just taking the pressure off the iron and I'm moving it ahead and laying it down. Again, count slowly to 10. I can peek now at my design that's sticking out here, and I can see if it is transferred, and it's transferred very well. So I know that it's going to work if I give it the amount of time that I started with. I recommend a dry iron because we don't want little puffs of steam coming and lifting this iron off the textile. And move along, and you can check as you go along to see that it's transferring. When you're done, lift your iron, lift the transfer away. Occasionally, you will have spots that didn't transfer well. So you could just use an ordinary HB pencil, and you could just darken those down a little bit for yourself. You can actually use the heat transfer pencil as well. The heat transfer pencil itself will eventually wash out, and it will also fade in ultraviolet light. So when you're working with your embroidery, don't leave this undone embroidery in the light, because it will fade over time, especially if you don't do your embroidery quickly. When you're ready to start stitching, you need to prepare your thread with the correct number of strands. In this weight of cotton, this will tolerate about 3 to 4 strands of this DMC cotton. I like to just use 3 strands because it makes it equal. Every time I cut that thread, I have 2 pieces that I get out of every length. Don't cut your thread too long. By the time you pass that embroidery thread countless times, every time you make a stitch, you'll have that very end of the thread quite worn out. So you don't want to start with too long a thread so that half of your work ends up too long. A good method to measure embroidery thread length for yourself is to just hold your elbows at your sides, extend the thread with your hands just sort of held in a nice comfortable position, extended out from your body, and that's about the maximum sewing length you should use actually for any sewing thread. I'm going to cut that off with a nice sharp cut using sharp scissors because I don't want those thread ends all frayed. It'll just make it easier to thread. To divide this 6-strand embroidery thread, I just reach in and try to separate it into 2 groups of 3, and because they have been twisted together, you need to give them a chance to untwist. So I take the 2 strands, I hold it out. If you have a partner that can hold that end for you as you pull, that's great, but just give it time to untwist as you're pulling them apart. So now I have 2 correct lengths of embroidery thread. I'll set the one aside, and I'm ready to thread my needle. If you're working with embroidery thread, you need an embroidery needle. And the beauty of an embroidery needle is that the eye is much longer than a regular sewing needle. It's still a sharp, pointed needle, but the eye is longer, and that's going to facilitate threading for you. A quick and easy way is to use a needle threader. This particular one will pass through the eye of the needle, You'll loop your thread around that little hook and you'll draw it back through. But this particular tool is quite thick, so it's going to be very usable on, say, a size 3 embroidery needle, but by the time you get up to a size 7 or 9, it's not going to be functional. But as you do more and more stitching, you'll get more and more adept at actually threading your needle. What I do is I take the eye of the needle and just fold the thread over the eye of the needle, pinch it between my thumb and forefinger, and then drive the eye of the needle down over that fold. And that nearly always works for me. You'll want to have a small knot on the end of your thread. There's 2 ways you can do that. This is a way that I think anybody can learn. Hold the needle in one hand and the end of the thread in the other. You'll notice I have not brought both ends of the thread down to be equal. I don't want a double thread. I'm just working with a single strand that is composed of 3 smaller strands. I'm going to lay that thread end on the needle and capture it with my right hand. When that's done, what I'm going to do is twist the remaining thread around the needle 4 or 5 times. I'm going to transfer those twists so that I can pinch them between my thumb and forefinger on my left hand, and I'm going to pull the needle through. So I maintain the pressure on these threads and I keep pulling this through right down to the very end, and I'll have created a knot. Now, because I've done that slowly, it's kind of a big lumpy knot, but it's a knot and it will work. The other method is to lay that thread on the forefinger, and because I'm right-handed, I'm going to lay this on my left forefinger, and I'm going to capture it with my left thumb. Wind it around my finger and cross over. So underneath my thumb there's a little cross on the thread, and that's my starting point. Then I'm going to take my forefinger and just run it down, squeeze it against my thumb and run it down my thumb, and I'm creating some twists of thread there. That's going to be my eventual knot. Now, middle finger comes along, pushes that onto the pad of my thumb, and I bring those all down and I have a knot on the thread. So whatever method it takes for you to get a knot on the thread, just trust that the more you practice it, the better and smoother it will become, and you'll get smaller and smaller knots as you're working. My thread is threaded, single thread. That means that the thread can move up as I consume it with my stitches, and I'm ready to get my hoop onto my fabric. I really, really like these Susan Bates hoops because they lock the fabric in place for you, and you don't have the added thing that you have to constantly tighten your fabric. It's going to stay nice and taut for you to do your stitches until you've run out of space for them. So as I mentioned before, I'm stitching through only 1 layer of fabric here on this cuff so that I can hide all of those thread ends and knots when I'm done by stitching it onto the bag of the pillowcase. So the hoop comes in 2 pieces, the inner hoop, which is just a ring, and the outer hoop, which has the adjustment screw on it. The inner ring has a little lip, and often they'll say right on this top, it'll say this side up, and this one does, you just can't see it because it's printed on the same color. So I want that little ridge or rim to be up, and I want to place my fabric over top of it. Now I am going to start by doing an outline stitch, so I may as well start at the end of my work where I can start at the very beginning of that line. You'll notice I have quite a small hoop here. I like this 5-inch or the 6-inch size for a hoop because it allows my other hand that's going to be doing some work pushing the needle up, it allows it space to get in from all edges. Too big a hoop and it's too awkward, or you're constantly moving your work to the side edge anyways. If you treat your putting on the hoop properly and you treat your thread properly, it's not going to harm finished stitches to put the hoop over them as you move along. So I'm loosening that outer hoop and I'm placing it down over top. Remember that little ridge is up, so I'm just going to make sure I bring that outer hoop up enough so that I can see and feel that ridge. And then I'm going to start to just tighten in that little screw clamp that's going to hold my fabric in place. As I'm doing it, I just give these a gentle tug to keep them snug and unwrinkled, but I'm not trying to make a drum out of this. It doesn't have to be super, super taut. It just has to be firm on there. So now with this tightened on, when I work with my fabric, I am going to be able to make continuous stitches without having to stop and constantly pull it down and tighten it in. So whoever invented this hoop, that was a great idea. I'm ready to start stitches, but just before I do, I want to remind you that an embroidery pattern has various symbols on it that are going to tell you the recommended stitch or a suggested stitch for placing your thread on top of that marking. As I said, these long continuous design lines that outline the design feature is called an outline stitch. Some people call it a stem stitch. I'll just call it the outline stitch, and I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to start from the farthest end so that I can make as long as continuous line as I can. Then you'll see up on the little mouse's cap, he's got a little pom-pom that's been indicated with some little teardrop symbols. Those little teardrop symbols could indicate that you could do a daisy stitch. The little dot in the middle will put a little knot. It will create just a little bit of texture in the middle and just create that one solid dot. In his little cap and on his little blanket, we see little crosses made, and what's going to happen is we're going to do a straight stitch over them, creating essentially a cross stitch, and in this case 3 stitches will go into that. And then you can see the little plaid lines on his blanket as well, and that's just a straight stitch into the fabric and out of the fabric. If you want to get really fancy, small enclosed areas like this tassel can be done in a satin stitch, or you can decide what you want to do to fill that in. So there's all sorts of filler stitches that you could use, but I'm going to keep it simple, and we're going to do 5 simple stitches that you can work to get him started in embroidery, and it will do most of the embroidery patterns that are on the market. Let's take a close-up look at the symbols used on this embroidery pattern to tell you what kind of stitch you might want to make. These solid lines that are around the blanket and the pillow and the mouse's face and ear, I'm going to be doing an outline or stem stitch on those particular symbols. This little symbol that is a teardrop symbol around the little pom-pom on his cap is set up for a daisy stitch. The little dot in the center, or the knot, is going to be a knot stitch. Some people will call it a French knot. I'm actually technically doing a knot called a bullion knot. These little crosses on his cap are straight stitches but placed in a cross stitch format. In this case, 3 little stitches will cross each other. But in this case, there's just 1 little stitch creating the little plaid pattern on his bed. So 4 stitches already that are just basic simple stitches that will see you through a lot. You can get fancy and give him satin stitch on the tassel of his pillow. So those 5 stitches combined will give you ample opportunity to do many, many embroidery designs. Let's begin with the outline stitch. I'm a right-handed person, so I am going to be making this stitch, which is a back stitch, from the left end side of the line toward the right end line. This particular design happens to start with the curve, so I will want to start at this end of the curve and move my way around. My left hand is doing some work. It's under the hoop here, and these fingers are pushing back on the tip of the needle to send it back up through the fabric. My right hand, of course, is making the actual stitch, and my left hand is pushing the needle back. If I was a left-handed person, the situation would be different. My right hand would be under here making the stitches, and my left hand would be making the stitch itself. So let's begin with the outline stitch by coming up from the back, because you do have a knot on your thread, right at the beginning of the line, and just pulling that thread taut but not ripping on it. We don't want to actually pull that knot through. You now make a decision. Am I always going to make these stitches with the thread below the line that I'm stitching or above the line that I'm stitching? It doesn't matter, you just want consistency. So I like to lock the thread underneath my thumb at the top, and I'm ready to make this stitch. You will notice that this stitch is a back stitch. That means my needle is always pointing back toward where I've already been with those stitches. I'm going to move ahead about 4 millimeters, and if I can do it smaller than that, great. You'll be surprised at how good and accurate you can be when you practice this a little bit. So I'm going back about 4 millimeters. I'm going to put the point of the needle in on the line come backwards and out on the line. And you'll notice I didn't take up the entire distance that I went forward. So I went forward about 4, made the stitch in on the line, out on the line, pointing back toward where I've been, but I didn't take up that full 4 millimeters. I only took up 1 to 1.5. Lay the thread down. Again, place it under your thumb, above the line or below the line, just be consistent. I'm ready to move on. This is where my first stitch started, so I'm going to go about 4 millimeters ahead, in on the line, out on the line, pointing back toward where I have already been with that stitch. Around a curve, the smaller you can make your stitch, the nicer that curve will end up being. You won't have little jogs in the line. So as I continue on, I'm always getting into the habit of putting my thread back into the same location, in on the line, out on the line, pointing back to where I have been already with the thread. Now, I want my stitches as much as possible to look the same all the way around. So I'm just maintaining that distance every time I make a stitch. So now I'm just going to emphasize what's going on with my under finger here. As I put the thread in, my fingers under here are just out of the way. I push the needle in, then my finger underneath here is pushing up on the tip of the needle to help me get it back through the surface layer of the textile. Again, in on the line, out on the line, pointing back. It's much harder if you don't make those fingers underneath do any work. It's going to be hard to get that needle to come back out. So the whole point of those fingers underneath there is to help you send that thread back out. One little tip that I would mention here is, as I stitch, I tend to turn that needle. There's just some reason why I put twists into it, and eventually that's going to really twist my thread and cause it to want to coil up. So I just sometimes take my stitching and I just let the needle fall and I let that twistiness come out of the thread, and then I move on. In on the line, out on the line, pointing back toward where you've been, taking that little step ahead every time. Another tip is, you'll say, why don't my stitches look like yours? They're looking joggy, they're looking not very smooth, and they're looking like there's all sorts of little points. And it's all going to come down to being consistent with having the thread always above the line or always below the line. So I've been stitching with my thread above the line, and that creates the angle of the stitches overlapping each other. Now on purpose, I'll make a stitch that's with the thread below the line that's incorrect. And so right away, I can see a little jog happening there. So now I'll make one that's correct, and I'll, just keep doing that without paying attention to what my thread placement is. And I can see that I'm not getting as smooth a line. So the way around those little jogs is to always place the thread either above the line you're working on or below, and be consistent. Our next stitch is going to be this little daisy stitch marking. Daisy stitch can be done over a straight line if you want. You can get fancy if you want to do that, or it can be done over these little teardrop markings. In a daisy stitch, your thread, like in the outline stitch, is never actually going to be pulled to the back of the fabric. So all work is done from the surface of the textile. I'm going to come up with my thread at the pointy end, and in this case the center end. This could be, this is a marking for a little pom-pom on the cap, and so they've unified the design by putting it at this end here. But it could also be the flower petal, a flower petal, and so you would have a little yellow center maybe, and then a little blue petal. So I have come up at the tip or the pointed end of that daisy marking. Now I want to create a loop of thread in this stitch. So I'm going to lay just a little loop into position, a little layer of the thread going up and beyond that stitch. Now to make the petal itself, back in exactly where I came out and out at the top of that marking, making sure as I pull the needle that it comes out over that little loop of thread that I've laid on the textile. So there's my little daisy stitch. And you'll notice I was pretty gentle when I laid it down because I don't want to pull too tight. All that will do is just close the edges of that little teardrop shape in, and it will ruin your stitch. To anchor that stitch down, I now let the needle leave the surface of the textile. It came up inside the loop, but I'm putting it down on the outside of the loop. So I'm on the back side of my work now. I'm going to come up at the pointy end. I'm going to lay my thread around in exactly where I came out at the end of the marking, making sure my needle is on top of that thread that I laid down there. Now I'm ready to anchor it down, so I'm going to send the needle to the back of the fabric, but it's on the outside edge of that little loop. Don't be too rough on your stitch here. You want it to have that opened effect, that petal effect. So that's the basic steps. Now you can start to take a shortcut when you're laying the stitch down. If I know that my stitch has to be anchored down by putting the needle on the outside of the line, I can do that, but I can also bring it up ready to go for my next stitch. Be gentle and you're ready to put on the next stitch. So I'm just making my way around this work, and these little markings are close enough that I can do all of these little symbols. I can cover all these little symbols without having to stop and tie a knot. Little dots on the work, and this is an area where my transfer was just a little bit light, so I'm just going to remind myself that those three little dots can be done in a knot, and there's a true way to make the French knot, but I like the way that I make knots, which are actually bullion knots, because they're a little easier to see and they're a little easier to make, and for a child to make these knots is much easier than a French knot. Again, I'm going to come up from the back of my fabric to the front through the middle or just near the center of that actual marking. I'm going to put the needle into the fabric and out. So remember, these fingers under here have to do some work. And I'm just going to take a tiny stitch over the area that the marking is on. But you'll notice I haven't pulled my needle all the way through. I'm now going to build up some twists on the needle. If I built up twists, by twisting it 10 or 15 times, I'd have a whole little coil of twists that would make what's called a bullion knot. But I'm just going to do a small version of that. So I'm going to take the thread that's coming out of the fabric. I'm going to hold the needle up. My hand under here is pushing on so that needle has a tip that's visible to me and I can see it. And I'm just going to wind the thread around the needle 3 or 4 times. Then make sure you don't have any twists or ties up on your thread, and it will just pass through. As you pull that needle, it will pass through, and those little twists can be sent down to the surface of the fabric. So I'm just basically making a little dot of thread in the form of some coiled up threads. And then I'm going to go back down right beside that knot. I'm not trying to go through it, I'm going to go down beside it. And these little markings are so close that I can come up and I can do my next marking right away. Again, I came up through about the center of the mark. I'm going to take a tiny stitch in and out right over that marking, but I'm not pulling the thread all the way through. The thread that's coming out of the fabric is going to get twisted around the needle 3 or 4 or 5. Experiment with it, see what you like. And I'm going to gently carry that through and send those little twists down. Push the needle back down through the fabric beside the knot. Don't try to go through the knot. So up, take a tiny stitch, but don't take the needle all the way through yet. Wind the thread coming out of the fabric 3, 4, 5 times around. Pull that gently through. Send those little twists down to the surface of the textile and go down beside the knot.
Okay.
I've moved my hoop so I can have access to these little cross stitches and straight stitches on the little blanket of the mouse. This is the simplest stitch, and it's one that if you're teaching a child to sew would be really easy to start with, because it's a simple matter of bringing the thread up from the back of the work through at the one end of the little marking and going straight down the other end of the marking. This is a good way to practice the motions of sewing. But one thing that a beginner sewer might have problems with is, as they bring their thread up, they may not yet have the muscle memory to keep that thread from sliding out of the needle. So as they bring it up, their needle is always unthreading, and that can be really, really frustrating. So as you're teaching yourself or someone to sew, you want to teach them to start remembering that this little finger has a job to do, and that is to pinch the thread so that it can't slide out of the needle. So as I make these little stitches and I bring this through, I grab it and I pull it through, and I'll have less frustration as I bring that through by just locking it in the fold of my little finger, or grabbing onto it and making sure that it doesn't come across. So that straight stitch is obviously pretty easy in in one end and out the other. Little kids might forget and come through and then make this happen. But that's easily repaired. You just take the thread off the needle and slide that stitch out. So there's lots of ways that a person new to stitching is going to run into trouble, but by using a single thread, you can save yourself a lot of agony. The little cross stitches on his blanket are essentially the same stitch. I'm just coming in at one end and going out the other, and then I'm crossing over. And this particular cross stitch has 3 stitches across, and so I'm making them just by coming up and going down through the fabric. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 easy stitches to get started with for embroidery. The one thing you might then want to know is, how do I tie off? I've come to the end of the design that I want in a particular color, and how do I end off? So I always end off by just doing 2 little, what I call loop knots. Where my thread has come through to the back of the fabric, find a spot where there is a nearby stitch just laying on the back surface. Slide the needle underneath that nearby stitch, thus creating a little loop in your thread, and pass the needle through that little loop. And just do that twice. So underneath a nearby stitch, through the loop, tighten it down, and you're ready to cut it off. 1/2 centimeter, a little tail cut off, is tidy, and it will hold and it won't come apart for subsequent use. When you've got your stitches done and you are worried, like say I've already done this line on the bed, and I might be worried about laying an embroidery hoop on work that I've already done, if you have used your hoop properly and laid your stitches down firmly but not super tight, there's no damage, no harm is going to come to your stitches by putting the hoop and moving the hoop. But because we do put a little bit of tension on that hoop when we're sewing, when we're getting ready to make our stitches, I just want to alleviate that tension when I go to put my work away. So if I had been working on this design, and you can see my hoop is now crossing over these various stitches on the end, and I've got them for the purposes of doing, say, my word Saturday here, I've got them tucked underneath the frame. When I go to lay this work down and I'm going to leave it for 24 hours or whatever, I'm just going to I'm just going to loosen the hoop so that I don't have that pressure on those yarns there. And you can either take the hoop off or just loosen it so that you don't leave that pressure sitting on those threads, and your threads will easily survive being covered by the hoop. I hope this was helpful in getting you started on some embroidery projects. It's a fun way to spend an evening, and it's something that even small kids, 8-year-old, 10-year-old kids can learn how to do embroidery, and they can be quite thrilled at their results.